Welcome back. We've gone through price elasticity of demand. We've talked about using the method, midpoint method, whatever you want to call it, in determining price elasticity. And now we're going to talk about I guess I can call them special topics in elasticity. And the first we're going to talk about is income elasticity of demand. And before we get into the formula, just if you remember when we were talking about demand shifters, one of the demand shifters was income. And so I guess it makes sense for some economists to use this price elasticity of demand or income elasticity of demand. And it's basically E to the Y is equal to the percent change in quantity demanded divided by the percent change in income. That's, basically the definition. So percent change QD divided by the percent change in Y, with Y equal the abbreviation for income. And it's percent change in quantity demanded at a specific price divided by the percent change in Y that produce the demand change. So now we're not talking about quantity demanded. We're talking about shifts in the demand curve, and that produce the demand change. All other things unchanged. And again, we're talking about shifting that demand curve. And if you remember, I can't remember which chapter it was. We discussed it, but we got into some things like, normal good, inferior good. We, talked about, substitutes, complements. So we'll get into that a little later. But as income increases, what happens to the demand curve? If it's a normal good, it's going to shift. It's going to shift. It's going to shift outward. It's going to increase or shift outward to the right, because as income increases, your demand for a normal good is going to increase. As income decreases, your demand for a normal good is going to decrease. And the flip side to that is when, again, go back to one of your earlier chapters, as income goes up, the demand for an inferior good goes down, opposite directions. If income goes down, the demand for that inferior good goes up. And, when they're talking about inferior good, people talk about SpaghettiOs and ramen noodles and Spam. And when they're talking about normal goods, they're talking about steak, and they're talking about, buying, diamond rings and, luxury cars. And when it's a normal good, the elasticity or the income elasticity of demand is positive, because price and the demand for that normal good both going in the same direction, either up or down. And the income elasticity of demand for an inferior good, if a normal good's positive, what's inferior good going to be? It's going to be negative, because income and the demand for the inferior good are going in opposite directions. So that's one way that you can tell between a normal good and inferior good, by looking at the income elasticity of demand. And then the text gets into cross price elasticity of demand, and it equals the percent change in the quantity demanded of one good or service at a specific price divided by the percent change in price of a related good or service. So now you're talking about the percent change in quantity demanded of good A divided by the percent change in price of good B. And if it's a complement, what do we say? Complements are tennis rackets and tennis balls, computer and computer mouse. And then if we're talking about substitutes, what are we talking about substitutes? Most people think of coffee and tea substitutes. So depending on the price of coffee, it's going to bump the demand on tea and vice versa. So substitutes, because of the way the formula works, substitutes are going to be with a positive sign. Complements are going to end up with a negative sign. And if it's unrelated, if goods are unrelated, tennis racket and a cup of coffee, it's going to be a zero. So, and they also talk about in the text, as far as substitutes, pencils and pens, complements, pencils and paper. And they actually give the example of pickles and pencils as unrelated goods, which definitely something I wouldn't have thought about. But and again, as we go down through this, so the increase in price of good A. So if it's a substitute, if the increase in price in good A is going to drive the demand of good, it's going, let's see, if it's substitute, it's going to increase the demand of good B. If the price of good A goes down, it's going to decrease the quantity or the demand for good B because they're substitutes. You're swapping them back and forth. If they're complements, an increase in the price of good A is going to drive down the demand for good B. So again, go back, if tennis rackets are so expensive that you stop playing tennis, you don't need tennis balls anymore. So why is there a demand for tennis balls? And so if the price of good A goes down, then the demand for good B is going to go up if they're complements. So just and again, it's easier for students to kind of map this stuff out and keep it kind of in their back pocket, because and if you get into a situation, especially once you get out in the workforce, again, I go back to my education, and as an undergraduate, seemed like it was a chemistry lab. But as an undergraduate, I had a professor tell me, he said, don't try to memorize all this stuff. He said, the important part is once you get out of school, doesn't matter how much you remembered of what you learned in school, the important part or the key to it is, do you know how to find the answer? Do you know how to go to the textbook? And back then it was a textbook. Do you know how to go to the textbook and find the answer? And now it's just, it's the same thing in this day and age. So don't get that hung up on where we're talking about, normal goods, inferior goods, complements, substitutes. Don't get hung up on all of that. Just think about normal goods. What's a normal good to you? Steak, really nice bottle of alcohol, normal goods. What are inferior goods? SpaghettiOs and Spam and those kind of goods. And when you're looking at substitutes, think about, coffee and tea. Think about, and so as you go through all of these gyrations, if you're thinking about coffee and tea, and if I ask you a question on the midterm, and if it's about substitutes or complements, just take a step back and kind of think your way through it. Substitute, coffee and tea. Price of coffee goes up. What happens to the demand of tea? Shoots up. What happens if and I'll use tennis rackets and tennis balls again. If the price of a tennis racket goes up to the point you can't afford a tennis racket, what's going to happen to the demand on your tennis balls? It's going to go down. So just think in terms of that. And again, if you get confused, at least in this day and age, you can find answers to just about anything on the internet. So if you're proficient at using Google, you can get the answers you want. Now we're going to talk just for a few minutes about the price elasticity of supply. And as we started out in the first part of this chapter, and I said generally, the price elasticity of demand is going to have a negative sign because the demand curve is downward sloping in most cases. Now, if I were to ask you, and you know absolutely nothing about how to calculate the price elasticity of supply, if I ask you what the sign was going to be of the number, what would you say? Remember, supply curve is upward sloping because why? Demand curve was downward sloping because at lower prices, people want more quantity demanded. At higher prices, they want less quantity demanded. Think about the supply curve. At higher prices, producers will offer what? More product for sale. Lower prices, they'll offer less product for sale. So if you know nothing about the price elasticity of supply, just knowing that the supply curve is upward sloping would automatically tell you that the sign on the elasticity computations we're going to make is going to be positive. It's the ratio of the percent change of the quantity supplied of a good or service to the percent change of the price, all other things equal, all other things unchanged, ceteris paribus. And it's the elasticity of supply is the percent change in QS, Q with a little subscript S, divided by the percent change in price. And as we just went through, it's going to generally be positive. So if it's going to be generally positive, if you think about what the numbers are going to be, if price elasticity of demand equal 1, and that was unit elastic, stands to reason that the price elasticity of supply, if it equals 1, is going to be what? Unit elastic. If you think about demand, we said in absolute values of demand, if it was greater than 1, it was elastic. So same thing with supply. Price elasticity of supply, if it's greater than 1, it's going to be elastic. And it just makes sense that if it's less than or equal to 1, it's going to be inelastic. So between 0 and 1, it's going to be inelastic. Actually, it's going to be less than 1 because if it's equal to 1, it's going to be unit elastic. So if it's between 0 and less than 1, it's going to be inelastic. And price over to the quantity gets you, and again, think about price and quantity and think about your supply curve going up. If you start down here at the quantity piece of it, and you can either go quantity up to supply and over to price, or you can go price over to supply and down to quantity. If you go price over to the supply curve and down to the quantity number, it's going to give you a certain number of units at a price. If you start down here at the quantity side and go up and then over to price, it's going to give you the marginal cost of bringing a unit to market. So if you think about that, if you're coming up from quantity and you hit the supply curve, and if you go over to price, that's going to say that's the price that's going to equal the marginal cost of bringing another unit to the market. Keep that in mind because that's something that may be useful for you over the next few weeks. Probably is going to be useful for you for the next 2 weeks. And if you look at the shape of the supply curve, especially the elasticity of supply, it depends on how quickly costs increase when producers expand output. Again, marginal cost. If costs don't rise much, it's going to be fairly elastic, or it's going to be somewhat flat. If costs rise rapidly, it's going to be pretty inelastic or steep. So if you have a vertical supply curve, the elasticity of supply is going to be 0. if you have a horizontal supply curve, the elasticity of supply is going to be infinity. And again, goes back to perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic, perfectly elastic. See, even I get confused because there's a lot of moving pieces on this. So anytime you see whether it's a demand curve or supply curve, if that thing is vertical, it's going to be perfectly inelastic. If it's horizontal, it's going to be perfectly elastic. And as it did with determinants of the shape of that demand curve, if it's going to be driven by cost and time. And as I said, depending on how the costs change, and there's more options to change price over time. So cost and time are going to be drivers as far as with the elasticity of that supply curve. And then it talked just a few minutes about elasticity of labor supply. And there you get into the trade-off of working and leisure. And if you go to the textbook and look at it, on the vertical curve, it talks about the wage rate or the dollars per hour. And then on the horizontal curve, it talks about the hours worked per week. And it's got this really weird supply curve because it starts up, and then it curves back onto itself. And that's because at some point in time, individuals, you, me, your neighbor next door, decide that I'm making enough money. I've made enough money for this week. I want to spend some time with my family. I want to spend some time watching the NFL this weekend. I want to spend some time watching college football. Go to the lake, go to the movies, just play golf, whatever. And so that's why there's at a certain point at a wage rate that curve starts bending backwards. And at the household level, you really see it because if one spouse, let's say it's a household with two incomes. So if one spouse gets a huge bump in salary or a huge bump in wage rate, it's not out of the ordinary to see the other spouse just quit working. They've got enough income coming in and decided that leisure is more important to them. Maybe one spouse wants to stop and take care of the kids. Maybe they want to do homeschooling. I don't know. But it's not out of the ordinary to see that. And it's also not out of the ordinary to see it. They talk about in the text with professional golfers. They know what that total dollar is that they want to achieve in a year. And as they get closer and closer to it, they may actually cut out some of the PGA events that they play in. And elasticities of both demand and supply drive the prices and drive the quantities. So that's where we're going to put the brakes on chapter 5. We pretty much, I think, have pretty much beaten elasticity to death. That's kind of like beating a dead horse. But at the end of the day, elasticity, while the first time you hear it, it seems like it is really complicated. But if you go back and you just think about, and you can actually go back to your algebra classes and think about, because we're talking about ratios, think about numerator and denominator and what happens to that ratio if one's bigger than the other. What happens to the ratio if they're the same? And then you start tying that back together with price elasticities of demand and supply. And you get into some of the other elasticities, income elasticities of demand. You're talking about normal and inferior good and cross price elasticities of substitutes and complements. And especially when you get into normal and inferior and substitutes and complements, just take a step back, especially if I ask you some questions on your midterm. Take a step back and just get you a piece of scratch paper and start thinking about it. Think about, coffee and tea. Think about tennis rackets and tennis balls. Think about, steak and, high-end automobiles. And think about, what you end up with, SpaghettiOs and Spam. And that makes it easier. to wrap your arms around it. And I think if you just take a step back and kind of think about just normal activities that you go through, normal choices. Again, what do we do in economics? We make choices. We study choices. Think about the choices that you make hundreds of times a day. And a lot of choices, it's almost automatic. You don't even think about it anymore. You don't even think about why you do it. But if you think about the choices and keep it simple, stupid. And so if you remember what that professor told me in graduate school and just follow the same concept, economics is not that difficult. It's not that bad, and it will help you explain a lot of what you see in your environment around you, and it will help you not only your academic career, but it'll help you as you get out into the workplace. And again, we're trying to help you build that toolbox. And so anytime you run into something that you think is too complicated to figure out, just take a step back, take a deep breath, try to make it as simple as possible. And 9 times out of 10, you'll be able to work through the answer. So that's going to wind it up on chapter 5. And the next time we touch base, we're going to be talking about chapter 6. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.